Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Path of Maximum Resistance. I'm going to say that this episode is going to be called a Blitz episode. My favorite podcaster, so I love the podcast. Obviously, it's one of the things that compelled me to start doing my own, is that I enjoy listening to podcasts myself. And my favorite podcaster is from a gentleman named Dan Carlin. He does a podcast. He does a few podcasts, one called Common Sense, but his most popular podcast that he's known for is called Hardcore History. Clearly, he's a historian podcaster. And he only posts a few podcasts a year because he researches them really significantly. And each one is really long, like 3.5, 4 hours long, but they're like exhaustive on the topic that they're covering. Anyway, when he does do a podcast that's a little bit shorter, he likes to call them blitzes. And based on that, I'm going to call this episode a blitz. So if his normal episodes are 3.5 hours long and his blitzes are like an hour, let's say if my normal ones are like an hour long and a blitz is shorter, well, this will be whatever the equivalent is there. This is going to be a quicker just foray into what I want to talk about. But the subject I do want to address today is something really exciting for me, because I'm going to talk, like I said, very briefly about a subject that's become a passion of mine. Throughout my life, there's only been a few consistent passions, one of which has definitely been music. I've always really loved music, from classical to electronic, that I've always been into. I went through a really big classic rock phase where I became obsessed with the Doors. I've always liked rap. I like all types of music, so that's been a consistent passion. Fitness, running. But more recently, something that's definitely consumed my life is coding. I really love to code. I found that it's not something I do just because I hope it becomes my occupation. I found that I legitimately enjoy coding. The whole intellectual exercise of learning new technologies, learning new languages, learning new frameworks, and just the infinite ability there is to explore the breadth of coding. You'll never sort of hit the end of the limit of knowledge when it comes to coding, and that excites me. Even when I feel like I hit, say, a roadblock with something specific I'm trying to learn about, I can just kind of divert my attention and look at something totally different, but within the greater context of coding in general, and I'll always be entertained. Some days when the very minutiae or the specific things about a coding language really starts to get kind of wound up around the axes, I can't figure out something very specific to, say, C#. Sometimes I'll step away and just start reading about TCP or IP or the protocols that make the internet work, and just look at things from a totally different perspective, and it just reinvigorates my energy for the entire subject. So that's what's cool. Coding is a very substantive topic, and it's one that always offers intellectual rigor and satisfies my curiosity. So today, though, really, I'm doing all of this just because I really want to talk about specifically my very favorite particular library within a specific language, and that's this library called React, which is a JavaScript library. And I really just want to talk about that because I love React, and I could talk about React all day. But in order to talk about React, it makes sense that I give you some context to my own web development experience, and just address some other issues. Though I'm not going to talk very much about the coding bootcamp I went to, only because I dedicated all of episode 7 to reviewing that experience. I didn't review the bootcamp that I went to specifically, but I did address what I thought of the bootcamp experience in general. So if you're interested in that aspect, go back to episode 7, watch that. You should go back and watch episode 7 anyway, along with all of the rest of them, or listen to them on SoundCloud. But in this particular case, I just want to talk in general about tech and about coding. And I do think if you are a aspiring developer, though I'm by no means an advanced developer, I would say I'm mid-level. And if I'm at the mid-level, I'm at the very baseline of mid-level experience, or the very tip of beginner. But with the little bit of experience I have encountered certain things that I'll address during this podcast that hopefully will, by you hearing them, if you're an aspiring developer, you might avoid the pitfalls that I had to overcome. Or maybe the aha moments, I like to call them aha moments, the moments of clarity where things start to make a lot of sense. Maybe if I tell you about them now, you won't have to go through all the hard work to generate them yourselves. Maybe you'll just hear about them and you'll be able to incorporate them into your learning experience just based on me bringing them up. So I will address some aha moments, how my knowledge base has developed, has grown, some of the things I've learned, and where I'm at now. So super exciting. So okay, it's kind of interesting because when I first got into, well, I shouldn't say when I first got into web dev, because I've been interested in web development my entire life. I talked about in episode 7 that I actually started doing web development back when I was in middle school. I would make real simple web pages, use FTP to upload them to GeoCities and post them that way. And I found it super fascinating. I've always just been intrigued with communications type things. And so the internet was certainly something that's always been interesting to me. But as like my professional life and the military and my career sort of took precedence, I kind of stepped away from it just because that's how life works. That said, so when I returned to web development thinking I was going to do it professionally, I have to admit that my actual intent wasn't to get into web development specifically. I really wanted to learn how to code. And when I say code, I was thinking more of like coding for like the operating system. And really, ideally, what my real goal was is I wanted to be able to look at any type of machine, say, for example, my refrigerator, and be able to manipulate it to do the things that I want it to do digitally. So when I should say it this way. So when I started to enter my educational experience for developing, I went down a path of web development, not totally intentionally. I guess maybe if I knew what I know now, if I would have known then, I would have directed my learning more towards embedded systems. But at the time when I first got into it, at least professionally and academically, I didn't realize there was a difference between web development and embedded systems. And really, to be honest with you, if you're trying to build a career and you're trying to get into the field and you need to make money, it makes sense to go into web development because there's a lot more I shouldn't say there's more job opportunities, because I feel like there's probably plenty of job opportunities for experienced embedded programmers as well. Probably there's probably even more opportunities for them. But the learning curve to become employable is a little bit more steep. So in web development, you can kind of get to where you need to be to become productive such that you can get a job. So it makes sense to kind of go the web development route and maybe from there branch into embedded systems, though I haven't made that branch yet. It's something I would like to do in the future. For now, I'm doing web development, and I'm discovering that the more I know about, the more I enjoy it. And the reason that is because web development really isn't that far away from doing embedded systems type work. And that's what was one of the first, as I was talking about aha moments, is that you sometimes, I guess, depending on where you came into the occupation of web development, you might not look at web development as coding per se. I would say for some people, they might consider coding to be like the embedded systems type stuff and web development to be like its own like stepchild sort of offshoot. But really, these days, web development has become so mature that you really are coding. This idea that you're building a website, and this is, like I said, this is kind of an aha moment. When I first got into building websites as a kid, the whole exercise was into displaying content that I wanted the user to see. That's what a website was. It was just, here's something that I want to communicate to you. Well, the paradigm for what we're building now in web development is totally different. If you just got into web development in the last few years, you wouldn't even have like that residual idea, because web development now is all about user interaction. So the idea of a web app, an application, is more true than it's ever been. Web apps are more prevalent than just websites, and that might be I'm making a separation there that might not be technically sound, but that's how I look at it. Like, there's websites, which is, your very basic web development, but really where you become productive now is in building web applications, which isn't so much the developer conveying information to the user, it's the user manipulating the application to do certain functions and activities that they need. Like, a website now is a piece of software. It's expected to work like a piece of software would work. So web development has become more coding, more like embedded systems than it used to be, at least in my perspective. And again, this is my super amateur look at things, but that's something that gives me sort of excitement about the field, because to just think you're building websites gets kind of it has a little bit less fulfillment than to think that you're building something very substantive, like or very substantial, like an application. So to know that what you're building now is an application, is really a piece of software, is kind of a neat way of looking at it. And I think that's helpful for people, especially if you're hitting a rut where you're losing some motivation. Just remember that there's almost nothing you can't do in web dev anymore. Like anything that you could build that you used to need, say C, like the programming language C, or you needed to write in like assembly or machine code, or anything that manipulated the operating system or the hardware, you can basically do in web dev now. It just might be presented through the browser, or it might be presented through like an app store, but whatever the case might be, you can basically do it all in web dev now, it really makes the field exciting. Like the options are almost endless, which is super cool. So that's one of like the very first like aha moments, is just seeing maybe the significance of the field, seeing your little perspective as a web developer, but you're really doing more than maybe you might think, or at least you're unlocking the door to a great wealth of potential in the productivity that you might be able to later on sort of get into. As I look down, it's because I have notes, so I'm going to keep my eyes down to keep me on track every once in a while. One of the things I've recently come to realize, and this has been super helpful, well, let's backtrack a little bit. You should know that, initially, I learned, like everyone else, I learned HTML, then kind of reluctantly I learned CSS. I say reluctantly because when I first got into HTML, it was so long ago CSS didn't exist. So when I came back into it and I had to learn CSS, I was catching up to like the gap of time where I'd missed. And then JavaScript. And JavaScript now is like ubiquitous. It is the internet. Like you need to do web development, you almost naturally, or you almost like inherently, I guess, or it's imperative that you know JavaScript to, be able to do that user manipulation I was just talking about. But something that was really difficult for me to wrap my head around is where other languages would fit into that paradigm. So I really wanted to learn an object-oriented language. And the one that I chose, basically because of the exposure I got to it through the boot camp I went to, was C#, which in internet parlance, it uses the framework .NET. But what I really struggled with for a while is seeing how .NET worked in relation to the internet. And that might not make a whole lot of sense on a conceptual level, but let's put it this way, like in JavaScript, when you write a JavaScript function, a lot of times the function is very immediately impactful. The function might be user clicks this button, user sees this thing, this message pop up. And the thing that makes that action of the message popping up after the button being clicked is the JavaScript code. Well, in .NET, it doesn't necessarily speak like that. Like you might still do data manipulation on the back end, and you might still have your event handlers to where you click a button, especially if you're using like old web forms. It still does work that way. But what really sort of opened my eyes was knowing that I could build any back end in .NET, and so long as I'm exposing the API in a standardized way, any client-side application can use it. And I'm not mature enough in my .NET experience to say that what I just said, that statement, with total sort of assurance. But I'm pretty sure that if you build a .NET, sort of like a middle tier application, it could probably be harnessed by an iPad. It can be harnessed by iOS. It can be harnessed by Android. Just so long as the API is exposed in a way that those other client-side applications could then manipulate, your back end. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is the reason that kind of opened my eyes is because you got to see the big picture. For a long time, I kind of thought about, I would get it all confused. I would be like, where does JavaScript exist relative to my .NET, relative to my database, relative to my controllers, relative to my views. And if you start to really lay it out and break it down, you can really see this nice sort of system where on the client side, and to go even further, you have to think about it like the client is literally downloading files and running them on their computer. So when they say client side, when you have to not just use these words, it's very easy to say client side or like the user or anything like that. But when you really start to think about what that means, okay, so in this case, the user is legitimately or literally downloading my JavaScript files and then using them, and they're actually running on his or her machine, relative in .NET, or say like your Ruby or Python or whatever other Java, whatever other like sort of server-side coding you might be using, that those files are running on the server. And I know that that's like internet knowledge 101, but I think you can go a long way into your career knowing those things on a superficial level and never really sitting down and thinking about them. And when you do actually think about them, I think it really unlocks some key discoveries, because then it sort of just makes sense to you. Okay, man, I want my JavaScript to run here. It's going to manipulate some data so that it looks a different way, or it's presented to the user in a certain way. But on my server, I'm going to like do some real, like, I'm going to store some persistent data that's going to tell me something about the user, that's going to be like, that's going to consist through time, or going to persist through a long period of time. The user might log off this machine, might go somewhere, come back a few days later, but that information that's on the server can then be sent back to the user's computer. Long story short, when you think about the big picture, I find it super helpful. So take the time to do that. Like, and I guess I don't want to get too sort of, not pedantic, but I don't want to sound like I'm preaching here. I'm trying to save any new developers sort of the months and months and months, and in fact year of time that I've spent trying to figure out these really obvious things that if at the very beginning, if you would just sit down and get like that baseline understanding, I think you'd be set up for better success in the future. So hopefully, though I'm trying to just like talk to you about things that are interesting to me, if I do start to say it in a way that sounds real declarative, or like I'm trying to, compel you to do something, it's only because I am super passionate about this stuff, and I do think some of the things that I've experienced can be helpful. So don't let my exuberance be, don't let it overshadow what I'm trying to do here, because really it's not about that. I just want to talk tech a little bit. So another big key aha moment, and this has been just amazing for me, is this recognition that there is no magic in the code. And that is something that I still, to this day, and I say to this day like I've been doing this forever, like I'm some master at it, but what I mean is I still struggle with the fact that when I get hung up in some code, especially like a code base that existed, like I didn't build myself, it was a pre-existing code base, and I come to some code that does something that I don't particularly understand how it does it, it's very easy for me to throw my hands up in the air and say, it's just magic. Like at some point, like I can figure out this level, but I get to a certain level and I just say to myself, maybe the computer is just doing it. It's just at some point, the computer, there's just a magic fairy, angel, wizard inside the computer that just magically does the thing that you needed it to do. Well, you come to find out that that's never the case. I mean, I know that sounds obvious, but really think about what that means. It's that, so say you come to in your code, or I'll say put this into my experience, I'll come to something in code that I'm working on where I see a method or a function that has a name that, isn't one that I created. So either someone else created it within the code base, or it's an existing method or function from the library that we're using. It's very easy to think that it just does some magic that I'll never be able to figure out. And when you start thinking about that, it's a huge sort of deterrent to your own learning. What you have to come to grips with is that everything that you see in code is just an abstraction from something that you could figure out on your own if you were to dig deep enough into it. And like if you were to break everything down into their individual pieces, they're all doing logically understandable actions. So no matter how complex of an action one method might complete, at its core, it's probably doing a ton of very simple things that are brought together to do that very complex thing that, it's saving you the time of having to write out yourself. But you have to realize that. Like, I know a lot of this stuff sounds super obvious, but it's easy to not see the forest for the trees, which is my big problem personally. So a lot of times it makes sense to just sit out and go, you know what? So say you have a method, and I'm just making this up, I'm not saying JavaScript has this sort of method or it doesn't, but say you have something that just automatically sorts an array, right? You might think to yourself, well, by using that method, it just like magically sorts the array. Well, it doesn't magically sort the array, it just does a bunch bunch of actions that you could have wrote out yourself if you took the time to do it. But that this existing method just kind of completes it for you. So the point being is that it's not like it's just manipulating the data by some sort of fairy dust. Like, it's literally running through actions that you could figure out on your own. So again, it sounds really obvious, it sounds academic, but I find it super helpful to just realize that, and this is the big part, there is no magic in coding. Like, everything needs to be performed. There are no shortcuts. Even there might be existing methods that make things easier, but they're still doing the work. Like, every single action that needs to be done is coded somewhere within your code, whether it's in a dependency, it's in the existing library that you're using, whatever the case might be, it's still happening. It's not just some magic. And that's a big deal. Like, just don't throw your hands up in the air and be like, this is way too advanced for me. Like, someone super smart figured this out. No, they just broke it down. Well, they are super smart, and most of them smarter than me. But what they really did is they just broke down the action into its most manageable parts and then completed this more complex action based on those fundamental incremental steps. I think that's super helpful. Oh, so this is pretty cool. So I'm starting to, so I'll be able to transition because, like I said, I did want this to be kind of a blitz episode, and I'm already up to 20 minutes, but this is going to be kind of helpful to transition me towards talking about React, because a really big thing to realize, and I'm not sure if this is super helpful for your learning, but at least for your enjoyment of your learning experience, I think this is a key thing to realize. And that's that every coding language, every library, every framework has a personality. Basically, and you might hear more, especially more experienced developers, the developers who are building frameworks and building languages, they might talk about like the sort of the mental model that each language presents. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So, and this is why I like React so much, because it's the mental model that exists within React, for some reason, is intuitive to the way I think. So you have to think about every language, library, framework, what have you, were all designed by a person or a group of people. So those people or that person developed it with his or her or their biases intact, right? So like, when they wrote this language, it wanted to solve certain problems, and the approach that they took to solving the problems is going to reflect how they think. So like, and there's many strategies to solve any one problem. So you might do it from a bunch of different approaches, and they might all solve the problem ultimately, but they all go about it a different way. And you'll find that with languages. Most languages are trying, in the end of the day, they're all trying to do the same type of thing, but they're all just approaching the problems in different ways. That's why like object-oriented programming is a different methodology from, say, functional programming, which it might be a little bit different from something else. But when it comes to these libraries, so like in JavaScript right now, two of the most popular, well, one's a framework, one's a library, but they're both kind of considered frameworks, just in general speaking. One's called Angular and the other one's called React. And when I first went to my coding bootcamp, we learned AngularJS, and since then I started to work with Angular 4. I started to work with it a lot, and I'd gotten pretty good with Angular before I tackled React. And I come to find out that React actually approaches its problem solving in a way that I prefer so much more than Angular. And until you start to really learn React, you won't necessarily know what I'm talking about. But with the way I think, I personally, and I'm talking about just me exclusively here, the way I, like, say if a user enters data, the way that React manipulates the data is the way that I would manipulate the data if I were to create a framework. Whereas, like, Angular does it in a slightly different way, a way that you can figure out, but for me, it isn't intuitive to me. Like, it's more, I feel like when I'm working with Angular, especially when it comes to like data binding and data manipulation and taking users' inputs and doing stuff with it, I find that I'm always kind of like swimming against the current. Whereas with React, and especially like when you're manipulating the state of your application, it's just totally in tune with how I would do it. The way it works, every once in a while it'll have like a little hiccup here or there. I kind of scratch my head. But that's true of like anything. Nothing's going to be, unless like I were to design the framework myself, it's obviously not going to be totally in tune with my own preferences. But for the most part, React just sort of works in a way that I expect. Like, if I write out some code, I don't even necessarily have to look at the documentation for React, because I'll write something out and it tends to work as I would expect it to. Whereas I find other languages, especially say like C#. So, like, I have a personal preference for .NET, C#/.NET, because that's what really got me into this. Like, on the professional setting, like, that's where I really started learning academically and really started to put my head down and really start to take this seriously, is when I started learning C#. So I'm always going to be biased towards C#, but C# for sure does not work in the way that I do. Like, I am constantly just like, when it comes to inheriting like interfaces and like using abstract classes, I'm just constantly going back to the documentation and just trying to make sense of it, just on like a very, very fundamental level. Whereas React, I notice I'm able to jump a little bit quicker into advanced stages, only because the fundamentals work as I expect them to. So it's really exciting. It's really, really exciting to be a React developer right now, which is what I'm more and more every day considering myself as a React developer. And then on top of that, when I start thinking about where web development is going into the future, I honestly, when I think about web development inside the browser, like someone sitting down at their computer looking at a website, that to me seems kind of ancient, and I feel like it's going to go away. Or if not go away, it's going to be for sure overtaken by development for mobile, which might have already taken it in precedence. So I was saying in episode 7, where I was talking about the coding bootcamp, I was saying that you're probably not going to learn how to develop for mobile in your coding bootcamp. And I kind of regret saying that now, because the more I learn, the more I find that I was wrong, to be honest with you. I feel like I was wrong in saying that, because my assumption going into that episode when I discussed that was this understanding that you need to know Java to be able to code for Android, or you need to know Swift or Objective-C to be able to code for like iOS. But come to find out that there's these other methodologies of coding for mobile that aren't native necessarily. So there's React, there's this library called React Native, there's another one called Xamarin Forms, and there's one called Ionic, which kind of like, you don't actually manipulate the hardware directly. You've been abstracted away from the native coding, but you're able to code for the hardware through like, it's basically a workaround, for lack of another word. And my understanding was that they didn't give the full functionality. By using, say, React Native, you wouldn't be able to, say, manipulate the hardware on your phone, like the camera and using maps and stuff like that. Well, I was totally incorrect. I'm starting to find out that React Native actually works really well. And actually, it's super exciting, because on top of that, I also thought that React Native, despite having the same name as ReactJs, I thought that syntactically it was really different. Somewhere in my head, I'd gotten this notion that React Native was way different than ReactJs. Now, digging into React Native, I'm coming to find out that they're almost totally the same. Like, they're so similar, it's crazy. And so long as you know ReactJs, you can jump to React Native pretty quickly. It's just a difference in using like your HTML tags, or your JSX tags, whereas you used to use like divs and spans and say p tags. Now you're using like view and text, and there's different features of like the hardware, like buttons and sliders and different things, and like the touch sensitivity and the opacity for when someone touches the screen. Those are all built into React Native, but they're really easy to pick up if you already understand ReactJs. So this is super exciting for me, because my whole goal lately has been to start breaking into developing for mobile, because I do think that's the future, and I think to be viable as an employee, you need to be able to develop for mobile. And I was kind of not hesitant, but I was kind of I can't think of what the right word is here, but I wasn't really looking forward to having to learn, say, Java just so I could develop for Android. It seemed like such a big undertaking for a very specific task. Like, I wouldn't use Java for anything else. Like, I wouldn't build my server-side coding with Java. I use .NET. I like .NET. So it would serve a similar purpose there. So it would basically be a whole lot of learning Java just to be able to code for one particular hardware. And same with, like, I would never had any goal of learning like Objective-C or Swift. So knowing that I could just do React Native and meet the same needs is so exciting. It's almost like I have like a head start into coding for mobile that I did not expect to have. In fact, yesterday when I started reading more about React Native, like as soon as I learned how much I could do with it, how functional it is, and how similar it is to ReactJs, it just like it made my entire day. I feel like I just have this huge jump start into something that I thought was going to be a tremendous task. Now it's still going to be a huge task, but it's not going to be as dramatic as I thought it was going to be. So that's really about it. The only other thing I really wanted to mention, I guess, is just I find the whole field of web development interesting based on your perspective of what web development is totally relative to when you came into the field. Like if you came into the field, say 10 years ago, you remember a time when JavaScript was not as ubiquitous and like web development means something totally different to you. Like I was saying, like you still remember the days of making websites that were just presenting data to the user. Whereas someone who came into web development 1 year ago doesn't even have that baggage. Like all they think about is building apps. And it's just interesting to think about that understanding, because it's such a quickly growing field that I don't know if this is true in other occupations, but there's almost like no tribal knowledge in the sense of there's no consistent understanding of what the actual field is. Like I imagine if you were to become like a car salesman and you were to join the auto dealership, all the car salesmen on the lot who have been there for 20 or 30 years will be able to tell you about the history of car salesmanship, and it's going to be the same story amongst all of the car salespeople. Whereas in developing, it's totally different, especially like in .NET. It's crazy when I talk about .NET Core and that I understand like how to build web APIs, and I know how to do like Razor, like use Razor for my view engine and stuff like that. It's a totally different field than like doing .NET back when they were doing like user controls and using web forms and just like drag and dropping things and then doing code behinds. And the understanding of it isn't like universal. So sometimes I'll say I understand .NET, and then the person who say is interviewing me will start asking me about like user controls and about like this web form type knowledge and like just stuff I don't know. Like when I talk about .NET, I'm talking about .NET Core, and it's just so different. But even amongst people who are very experienced, everything moves so quickly that it's not a universal understanding. So you can talk to people who are super smart, super experienced, especially about like .NET, and even they'll get confused by, are you talking about like MVC5? Are you talking about like, you know, Razor view engine? Or are you talking about like whatever, ASP.NET? It's just it's crazy how it's all changed so quickly, and that your entire view, your entire philosophy and understanding of the field will be different than someone else who works right next to you, just based on how they came in and how they approach the entire profession. So anyway, it's a really interesting field. I'm super excited to be working with React right now. Man, if I could just do everything in React. I'm actually about to start a course on React Native. I actually feel like I could jump right into React Native. I was actually thinking about making the website that we have for this blog, maxresistanceblog.com. I was thinking about making like a native app for it, even though like it would just be like a proof of concept, because I can't imagine why anyone would actually download the app that didn't. It would just be videos, so like there wouldn't be much functionality to it. But I was thinking about just building it just for an exercise of my own. But what I'm actually going to do, though I feel like I could totally do that, I'm totally capable. I'm actually going to take a full-on course. Stephen Grider has a course on Udemy. I was actually trying to decide between his course and Max Schwartzmüller's. I think I might say his name wrong. I do a lot of his courses too, and I was trying to decide which of the two I was going to choose. I'm actually choosing Stephen Grider's just because it also pulls in Redux, which is another library. And to be honest with you, as much as I know about React, I'm not as up to speed with Redux, and they kind of go hand in hand. So I need to get on top of that. So I'm gonna start that course. That's the goal starting today. Also, you might have noticed I added a blog, an actual written blog, to the website, maxresistanceblog.com. I'll start updating that with just like topics that are on my mind that don't quite come to the depth of, you know, taking up a whole half an hour video. So they'll just be like quicker thoughts here and there. A lot of them I think will be tech related, just because I'm always thinking about tech. I'm always thinking about web dev. Other than that, also, I'm still looking for a job. So if you happen to watch this and you're a person who needs to hire a web developer and anything I talk about makes sense to you and it seems like I might be a person who could help your company, my resume is actually online. It's bogoodski.com, and I'll put that down in the information. I'll spell it out real quick. BOGOODSKI.com. That's my resume. It goes through the breadth of my career, even my non-coding experience. So it doesn't go real in depth with what I do with coding, but it does talk about in general terms everything I've done throughout my experience. So anyway, take a look at that. Hook me up if you want to hire me, because that would be awesome, because I need a job. And otherwise, I don't know what the next episode is going to be about, but I hope you enjoyed this one. And until then, I, along with Rue, she's down here, I was just hanging out with her, we both say goodbye, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.